Ever get that feeling like you're not totally in control? Like something else is kind of pulling the strings.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That feeling's been around forever, but Freud really brought it into the spotlight.
Right, with all that stuff about the unconscious mind. It's kind of a mind-blowing concept when you really think about it. Like, how well do we really know ourselves, you know?
Exactly. It really challenges those assumptions about free will and all that.
So today we're going to do a deep dive into this whole idea of the unconscious mind. And we've got a great YouTube video to guide us titled, Was Freud Right? The Unconscious and the Illusion of Control, from the channel Mirror of Soul.
Great video. It really digs into some of the more unsettling aspects of Freud's theories.
Definitely unsettling, but also super fascinating, right? I mean, we're talking about this hidden part of our minds that's supposedly shaping our lives without us even realizing. Kind of scary when you think about it.
It is, a little bit. Yeah. But it also offers a really powerful framework for understanding ourselves and our behavior.
Okay, so for anyone who needs a quick refresher, Freud was this, revolutionary figure in psychology. And he basically said that there's way more going on beneath the surface of our minds than we tend to think.
Right, and it's not just about like forgotten memories or repressed traumas.
Right. It's more than that. It's this dynamic, powerful force that's constantly influencing us, even when we have no clue it's happening.
Exactly. It's not just a passive storage unit down there. It's active, it's alive, and it's shaping our thoughts, our feelings, even our personality.
Okay, so how did Freud even stumble upon this whole idea of the unconscious? The video mentions he started working with patients who had hysteria.
Yeah, these were folks experiencing physical symptoms that didn't have any clear medical explanation, things like paralysis, seizures, that sort of thing.
So doctors were basically stumped. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with these people.
Right, and that's where Freud's genius comes in. He realized that these physical symptoms were actually like messages from the unconscious mind.
It's like their bodies were trying to express something their minds couldn't.
Exactly. They were dealing with all these deep, unresolved conflicts, often stemming from traumatic experiences or forbidden desires that their conscious minds just couldn't handle. So those repressed feelings found a way to express themselves through physical.
Wow, that's pretty wild. It makes you wonder if other seemingly random symptoms or behaviors could have deeper roots too.
It really does. Freud's work suggests that we might not always be the most reliable narrators of our own experience.
Okay, so we've got this unconscious mind that's a lot bigger and more active than we tend to think. But how does it all work? The video uses a pretty powerful metaphor to explain this whole thing.
Right, the iceberg metaphor. The tip of the iceberg is what we see above the surface. That's our conscious mind.
And all that stuff lurking beneath the water, that's the unconscious.
Exactly. And it's huge, way bigger than the part we're aware of. It really gives you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about here.
So basically, we're only aware of a tiny fraction of what's going on in our own minds. That's kind of mind-blowing and a little creepy, to be honest.
It is a bit unsettling. And a key part of this is repression, which is how our minds protect themselves from stuff that's just too painful or difficult to deal with directly.
So we're talking about pushing down uncomfortable thoughts, maybe traumatic memories, or even desires that we consider unacceptable.
Precisely. Repression is like this defense mechanism. It buries those things we don't want to face. But here's the catch. Repressing something doesn't make it go away.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. It's like it just festers down there in the unconscious, right?
Exactly. And it can resurface in all sorts of ways, often disguised as symptoms, anxieties, or even just random weird behaviors.
It's almost like our unconscious is constantly trying to communicate with us, but it's speaking in this code we don't understand.
Exactly. And to decipher that code, to really understand what's going on beneath the surface, we need to dive into Freud's model of the psyche.
You mean the id, ego, and superego. I always found that part kind of confusing.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head-scratcher at first, but it's really this brilliant, almost like Shakespearean drama playing out inside our minds.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's break it down. So the id, if I remember correctly, is like the most primal part of us. It's all about instinct and pleasure, right?
You got it. Pure instinct, driven by pleasure and immediate gratification. The id doesn't care about consequences. It just wants what it wants when it wants it.
So kind of like a toddler throwing a tantrum because they can't have candy.
Perfect analogy. But instead of candy, the id is after, primal urges, things like hunger, thirst, and what Freud called libido.
Libido,
Yeah.
Right, which is kind of a loaded term, but it doesn't just mean sexual desire, right?
Right. It's more like this broader drive for all sorts of pleasure and satisfaction.
Okay, got it. So we've got the id, this impulsive pleasure-seeking force. And then there's the superego, which is kind of like the opposite.
Yeah, you could say that. The superego is like our internalized morality, all the rules and expectations we've absorbed from society and, our upbringing.
So it's the voice of conscience telling us what's right and wrong, what we should and shouldn't do.
Exactly. It's that inner critic, always trying to keep us in line.
And then, stuck in the middle of this whole tug of war, is the ego.
Poor ego. Always trying to play referee between the id's demands and the superego's judgment.
So it's the mediator, the rational part of us that tries to find some kind of balance.
Exactly. And it has to do all this while navigating the real world with all its, complexities and challenges.
That sounds exhausting. No wonder we all feel a little neurotic sometimes.
Well, about that, Freud had some very specific ideas about neurosis. But before we get into all that, it's important to emphasize that this whole dynamic between the id, ego, and superego is mostly unconscious. Like, we're not aware of these forces that are shaping our thoughts and actions.
So we might think we're making, perfectly rational choices, but in reality, there are all these unseen battles raging in our minds.
Exactly. It's one of the most challenging and mind-blowing aspects of Freud's work. It suggests that we might not be as in control of ourselves as we like to believe.
That's a bit of a scary thought, but also kind of liberating in a way. Like, maybe we can cut ourselves some slack when we mess up.
Maybe. But it definitely opens up a whole new way of understanding ourselves and our behavior.
Okay, so we're starting to see how this unconscious battle between the id, the ego, and the superego might actually play out.
Yeah.
But how does all this relate to our personalities? Like, is Freud saying our unconscious is actually, shaping who we are as people?
Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying. It's like, think about it. Someone with a really strong superego might be, super rule-focused, maybe even a bit judgmental, because they're constantly trying to live up to all those, internalized expectations.
Right. So they're always trying to be good, always trying to do the right thing, but it might actually make them kind of miserable or uptight.
Exactly. And on the flip side, if the NZ is kind of running the show, you might get someone who's, impulsive, always chasing pleasure, maybe even reckless sometimes.
Yeah, I can definitely think of a few people who fit that description.
Right. It's fascinating how these different parts of the psyche can manifest in our personalities. And the thing is, most of this internal struggle is, it's happening under the surface. We might think we know why we act the way we do, but Freud would say there are deeper motivations at play. And a lot of it goes back to our childhood experiences.
Speaking of childhood, the video talks about how Freud believed our early relationships, especially with our parents, have a huge impact on our adult life. Even if those relationships seemed pretty normal on the surface, there might be things from that time that are still influencing us without us even realizing.
Unconscious patterns that shape how we attach to people, how we handle conflict, how we respond to authority figures, all sorts of things. It's like a blueprint for our relationships in adulthood.
So those early years are really shaping who we become in ways that we might not even be aware of. That's a pretty powerful idea. But how do we even begin to understand these unconscious patterns? So how do we even know they're there?
That's a great question. And it brings us to another one of Freud's key concepts, neurosis. Now, I know when we hear the word neurotic, we might think of someone who's just kind of anxious or high-strung.
Yeah, maybe someone who washes their hands a million times a day.
Yeah.
Or freaks out if their books aren't perfectly aligned on the shelf.
Right. But for Freud, neurosis was much more than just everyday quirks. He saw it as a way the unconscious tries to signal that there are unresolved conflicts, bubbling beneath the surface. It's our psyche trying to get our attention, saying, hey, there's something here you need to deal with. But it's not speaking directly. It's speaking through these symbolic symptoms.
So those seemingly random anxieties or phobias, or even those obsessive compulsive behaviors, those could actually be clues to deeper issues we haven't addressed. I'm starting to see how this whole thing is like a giant puzzle.
Exactly. It's the unconscious is sending us these coded messages, and it's our job to try and decipher them. The video gives this really interesting example. Someone with a fear of contamination. On the surface, it might seem like they're just afraid of germs, but Freudian might suggest that the fear is actually a symbol for something else, like unconscious guilt over something they did or even just thought about.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Makes you wonder what other hidden meanings might be behind our everyday anxieties and fears. The video also talks about how people who have a really hard time making decisions, they could also be struggling with something deeper too.
Yeah, exactly. Freud might say that their indecisiveness, it stems from an unresolved power struggle. Maybe something that originated in childhood. Maybe they felt powerless in certain situations as a kid. And now that feeling is manifesting as this inability to make choices, even seemingly small ones.
So what we see on the surface, the behavior, it might just be the tip of the iceberg, right? There could be all these deeper meanings and motivation driving our behavior. It really makes you think twice about judging people's quirks or anxieties.
Absolutely. We never know what someone might be carrying with them, what battles they might be fighting within their own mind.
So if we're carrying all this baggage, all this unresolved stuff from our past, what can we do about it? Is there any way to actually work through these unconscious patterns and maybe even change them?
That's where therapy comes. Freud developed this method called psychoanalysis, which is all about bringing those unconscious conflicts and desires into conscious awareness so they can be addressed and worked.
So therapy isn't about erasing the unconscious or pretending it doesn't exist. It's more about understanding it, learning its language, figuring out how to work with it.
Exactly. And a key part of that is recognizing that our memories, they aren't always reliable narrators. Freud believed that the unconscious can actually distort our memories, shape our perception of the past to protect us from painful truth.
It's not just that we forget things, but we might actually rewrite them in our minds.
Yeah.
Makes sense when you think about how sometimes our childhood memories seem so different from what our parents remember.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why simply remembering something, it isn't always enough to heal from it. We need to explore how those memories might have been shaped by our unconscious, how they might be serving as a defense mechanism. That's where the therapist comes in. They act as a guide to help us navigate those tricky waters,
So it's a process of self-discovery, but it's not something we have to do alone. Having a trained professional there to help us interpret the symbols and challenge our defenses can make a huge difference.
Right. And it's a process that takes time and commitment. But ultimately, the more we understand our unconscious, the more freedom we have to make conscious choices that are actually aligned with our, true selves.
Okay, so we're starting to see how working with the unconscious can be beneficial on an individual level. But what about those broader societal implications we touched on earlier? The video mentioned that Freud believed the unconscious also shapes things like culture, morality, even religion.
Yeah, that's right. He didn't just see the unconscious as a personal phenomenon. He saw it as this collective force that shapes entire society.
So things like cultural norms, the things we consider acceptable or taboo, even our belief system, those could all be influenced by unconscious forces.
That's the idea. Think about the concept of social taboos, for example. Freud might say those are a form of collective repression, a way for society to push down certain urges or desires that are deemed unacceptable.
So it's like society as a whole has its own unconscious mind, trying to maintain order and control.
That's a great way to put it. And this raises some really interesting questions about free will, both on an individual and a societal level. If our choices and even our cultural norms are being shaped by these unconscious forces, how much agency do we really have?
That's a huge question, and one we'll definitely want to explore further. But before we do, I think it's important to acknowledge that, Freud's ideas have been they've been both praised and criticized over the years. Some people see his work as revolutionary, while others find it, too deterministic or even sexist.
Right, and it's important to remember that Freud was a product of his time. Some of his ideas might seem outdated or even offensive today. But I think it's important to engage with his work critically. Take what's valuable and leave behind what's not.
I agree. And even if we don't agree with everything Freud said, I think his work still has a lot to offer in terms of helping us understand the hidden complexities of the human mind.
I couldn't agree more. He gave us this incredible framework for understanding ourselves and the world around us in a deeper, more way. And that's something worth grappling with, even if it makes us uncomfortable at times.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the id, the ego and the superego, the concept of repression, the role of childhood experiences, and how all of this relates to neurosis and even broader societal patterns. But there's still a few key points from the video that I think are worth revisiting, especially as we start to think about what all this means for our understanding of free will and the potential for change.
I think that's a great idea. Let's dive back into the source material and see what other insights we can glean.
Okay, so we're back and ready to, really wrap up our deep dive into the unconscious mind.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, right? All these hidden forces that might be shaping, our personalities, our choices, even our society.
It's heavy stuff, but it's also, kind of liberating in a way. Maybe we don't have to beat ourselves up so much when we make mistakes.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's definitely a different way of looking at things.
So before the break, we were talking about some of the key takeaways from that YouTube video. Was Freud right? The unconscious and the illusion of control.
Right. There were some really interesting points in there.
One thing that really struck me was this idea that sometimes, we don't fully understand why we do the things we do,
Oh, yeah, definitely. We come up with these explanations for our actions, but deep down, the real motivations might be a bit of a mystery. even to us.
Exactly. It's like we think we're being irrational, but really, who knows what's driving us?
Well, Freud would say that a lot of our behavior is driven by these unconscious impulses and desires, right? The stuff we're not even aware of.
The video used that example of like falling in love. We might say it's because of someone's intelligence or their sense of humor or whatever, but what if it's really because they like unconsciously remind us of a parent or someone from our childhood?
Yeah, that's a pretty wild thought, isn't it?
It is. And it's not just about romantic relationships, right? It could be anything, our careers, friendships, even our political beliefs.
Absolutely. We like to think we're making these big decisions based on, logic and reason. But Freud might say it's worth asking ourselves if there are deeper unconscious factors at play.
So it's like we have all these hidden biases and motivations swirling around beneath the surface, kind of messing with our decisions without us realizing it.
It's true. It can be a little unsettling to think about.
It is. But the video also emphasized that understanding these unconscious patterns, it's not about feeling powerless or defeated. It's about becoming more self-aware, right?
Exactly. The more we understand about our unconscious, the more equipped we are to navigate those hidden currents and make choices that are actually in line with, our values and our goals.
So if we can start to recognize those patterns, those recurring themes in our lives, maybe we can start to break free from those self-defeating behaviors and make more conscious choices.
That's the hope. And it takes a lot of honesty and a willingness to look at those parts of ourselves that we might not like, but it's worth it,
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about individual growth, but the video also touched on those broader societal implications, like how understanding the unconscious could help us understand social problems too.
Oh, absolutely. If these unconscious forces are shaping our individual choices, it makes sense that they're also shaping our, collective behavior, our cultural norms, our institutions, everything.
So it's not just about understanding our own personal quirks. It's about recognizing how those unconscious patterns might be playing out on a much bigger scale, contributing to issues that affect everyone.
Exactly. And that's where I think Freud's work remains incredibly relevant. He was one of the first to really delve into the power of the unconscious, both individually and collectively.
Right. And even though some of his ideas might seem outdated today, he really gave us this framework for understanding ourselves and the world in a much deeper way.
For sure. It's a framework that's worth exploring, even if it's challenging or makes us a little uncomfortable at times.
So I guess the big question is, if we're all influenced by these unconscious forces, is there any hope for real change, either in ourselves or in the world?
That's the million-dollar question. And I don't think there's an easy answer. Freud himself wasn't, super optimistic about humanity's ability to overcome its darker impulses.
So he kind of thought we're always going to be struggling with these forces, like trying to keep them contained.
Yeah, kind of. But I also think there's room for, for hope and growth. The more we become aware of these dynamics, the more we develop tools to understand and work with them. It creates the possibility for greater freedom, both for ourselves and for society as a whole.
It's like shining a light on those dark corners of our mind. We can start to reclaim some of that power those unconscious forces held over us for so long.
Exactly. And while we might never be fully in control, I think the journey of self-discovery, the pursuit of greater awareness, that's what really matters.
I love that. So to wrap things up, what would you say is the one key takeaway from our deep dive into the unconscious mind?
Don't underestimate the power of your own mind. There's so much more going on beneath the surface than you realize, but it's worth exploring those depths because the more you understand about your unconscious, the more you can unlock your potential and create a life that's truly aligned with who you are.
That's a great message. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey into the world of the unconscious mind. We hope it's inspired you to keep exploring and questioning. Until next time.